Urbanary. The podcast exploring how we understand and live urban spaces.
Hi everyone, I'm Lucy White. This episode is part of Water in Conflict, a series uncovering how every dam, pipeline, and policy can turn water into a political battleground. This is Flows of Power, how water treaties produce water scarcity, an episode I wrote together with Laila Kouta, Toka Elsayed, and Alexia Lara. You're listening to Urbanary. September 2020, Chihuahua State, northern Mexico. At Boquilla Dam on the Conchos River, access is blocked. Protesters, many of them Mexican farmers, occupy the entrance in an attempt to halt the release of water. What is being contested is the material execution of an international obligation. The order to open the sluice gates comes from the CONAGUA, the National Commission on Water, enforced by the Guardia Nacional. Its rationale is treaty compliance. Under the 1944 Water Treaty, Mexico is required to deliver a fixed volume of water to the United States from tributaries, smaller rivers that feed into the main river of Rio Grande, located entirely within Mexican territory. In 2020, that obligation wasn't met. Releases from reservoirs such as La Boquilla become the primary mechanism through which to fulfill this obligation, concentrating costs and impacts on specific territories. In 2020, approximately 2,500 people gather at La Boquilla Dam. Among them are Jessica Silva and her husband, Jamie Torres. The protests unfold in a highly tense atmosphere, following months of escalating confrontation between local agricultural communities and state authorities after the federal occupation of the dam in February to ensure continued water deliveries to the United States. In the months leading up to September, protests were accompanied by increasingly confrontational actions, including attacks on government buildings, the destruction of official vehicles, the brief detention of politicians, and prolonged blockades of a key railway corridor linking Mexico and the United States. It is against this backdrop of sustained tension and heavy federal deployment that the events of the shooting unfolded. Hours after the protest, while driving back in their pickup truck, Silva and Torres were intercepted by members of the National Guard. According to the Guard, troops were transporting several detained protesters to Delicias when their convoy was approached by other vehicles and an attack was perceived. However, the circumstances of the shooting remain contested. Amnesty International reports that neither Silva nor Torres was armed and that the lethal force was used in a context marked by confusion and the absence of clearly identifiable immediate threat. Jessica Silva is killed, her husband survives, but with serious injuries. In the aftermath, 6 members of the National Guard were arrested and charged with homicide and attempted homicide. Her death is quickly mobilized in public discourse as a symbol of resistance.
Presidente, no hay manera de pedir ninguna prórroga o de abrir una renegociación con Estados Unidos. ¿Esto no es factible jurídicamente?
No, porque tenemos que cumplir. Además, hay muchas presiones.
¿Sabe qué? Su comandante en jefe nos está traicionando y nos está robando el agua que nos pertenece. Es un traidor y un dictador. Ahorita se lo estoy diciendo.
By the end of 2020, Mexico fulfills its outstanding water deliveries. Treaty compliance is thus achieved. The territorial conflict that accompanied it is rendered administratively irrelevant. The notion of water debt may sound metaphorical, but it describes a geometry in which water flows are fixed at the international scale, while the social and ecological costs of delivery are absorbed locally. This geometry is not natural. It is the outcome of a treaty regime consolidated in 1944. As we begin working on water in conflict, a reoccurring question emerged. How do legal frameworks designed to stabilize transboundary relations generate instability within states? This episode takes La Boquilla Dam as a point of entry to examine how international water law materializes on the ground revealing water infrastructure as a site where sovereignty, uneven power geometries, competition over natural resources, and violence are actively produced.
I rise to address the dire consequences of Mexico's failure to meet its 1944 water treaty obligations. The recent closure of the Rio Grande Valley sugar growers, a Texas sole sugar operation, is a direct result.
To understand what unfolded at La Boquilla, we first need to understand the 1944 U.S.-Mexico Water Treaty and its territorial logic. The treaty governs two transboundary river systems, the Colorado River flowing from the U.S. to Mexico, and the Rio Grande. Together, these rivers shape large portions of the U.S.-Mexico border and have long been governed through a succession of treaties that regulate how their waters are shared. Under the Treaty of 1944, the United States delivers water to Mexico from the Colorado River, while Mexico must deliver water to the U.S. from tributaries of the Rio Grande. The Colorado River, on one hand, flows almost entirely within the United States, crossing 7 states: Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and lastly, California. On the other hand, as the main Mexican tributary of the Rio Grande, the Rio Conchos concentrates a large share of water storage within the state of Chihuahua. It is therefore unsurprising that cooperation, in practice, depends on releases from reservoirs prevalently located in that state. The two river systems, the Colorado River and the Rio Grande, operate in fundamentally different ways. On the Colorado River, the obligation is clear and stable. Each year, the United States must deliver 1.5 million acre-feet of water to Mexico. This volume is released through a large, redundant system of dams spread across multiple states and basins. When scarcity occurs, its impacts are territorially diffused. The Rio Grande follows a different logic. Here, Mexico must deliver an average of 350,000 acre-feet per year to the United States, not from a single river, but from 6 tributaries, all located entirely within Mexican territory. One of these is the Rio Conchos, which historically accounts for around 70% of the total flow delivered to the United States. The treaty does not ask where water is needed to live or farm, but where it can be extracted. As a result, when Mexico falls into deficit, it does not renegotiate volumes at the national scale. Instead, it opens dams and tributary basins. Thus, international compliance is achieved by concentrating the impacts on specific territories. On the Mexican side, water deliveries are assessed through 5-year accounting cycles. This design reflects the fact that water availability in the region is highly variable from year to year. Rather than requiring the same volume annually, the treaty allows Mexico to adapt to droughts, floods, or other disruptions. In cases of extraordinary drought, if Mexico cannot deliver the full amount within a cycle, the shortfall can be rolled over to the next one without being considered a violation of the treaty. While this system appears flexible, it allows shortfalls to accumulate quietly, often becoming politically explosive as the cycle nears its end. The 2015 to 2020 cycle, the one this episode focuses on, was particularly critical. Earlier periods of scarcity, such as the severe 1994 to 2003 drought, were cushioned by fuller reservoirs and sporadically wetter years. This wasn't until late September 2020, when, about a month before the end of the 5-year cycle, Mexico was still short on roughly 378 million cubic meters of water. In the final days before the deadline, this gap was closed through a combination of emergency releases from upstream national dams and a transfer of approximately 130 million cubic meters from the Amistad and Falcon reservoirs. This brings us to La Boquilla Dam. By September 2020, reservoir levels across the Rio Conchos basin were already low, yet federal authorities announced further releases to meet treaty obligations. For local farmers, this meant losing water already allocated to crops and livelihoods. For farmers across Chihuahua, the 2020 crisis came down to a simple question: would there be any water left for the next crop growing season? Many felt the basin had already been pushed far beyond its limits and that further releases from La Boquilla would have dramatic impacts on local communities. Nearly 20,000 farming families depended on that water. The sense of pressure was sharpened by a 2017 bilateral deal under which the United States agreed to fund new water infrastructure along the border, while Mexico committed to make additional water available in return. For many farmers, this looked and felt like a trade, even a kind of natural resources sale, despite official claims to the contrary. We discussed this with Victor Daniel, a native of Mexico's agricultural heartland. He has deep knowledge of the sub-basin and is personally connected to local ranchers and farming communities. He helped us see how the 1944 water treaty plays out as a daily struggle for families and farmers whose lives depend on every drop of water and how they are coping with these shortages.
For my career, I study about the subbasins in Mexico. So there is a lot of ranchers that doesn't have the, how do you call it, the allowance to make a well in the surface. But anyway, because like there is a lot of corruption in that movement of making wells or water pits. Many people do it illegally because the subbasins are in the ranch, so technically it's their property. But all the subbasins are these water bodies that the government are the owners of them. So technically it's illegal, but many ranchers also do it because they have connections in the government. So
what Victor is describing is a territorial confrontation. In the Río Conchos basin, ranchers treat water as something that belongs to the land they work on. It runs through their wells and their fields, nurturing their daily subsistence. Their claims are grounded in use and occupation. The federal state, by contrast, sees the same water as an abstracted stock stored in reservoirs and mobilized to serve geopolitical obligations. La Boquilla stands exactly where these two regimes collide. When the gates were opened in 2020, it wasn't just water that was released. The protests and the seizure of the dam exposed what had been quietly accumulating for years, a fight over who controls the circulation of water in the basin and who is forced to absorb the losses when that circulation is reorganized. In Chihuahua, water is scarce, and like all scarce resources, it is fought over. But that scarcity is not simply a material condition. It is produced through the entanglement of climate, infrastructure, and politics, all of which are increasingly characterized by uncertainty and ruptures. Prolonged droughts, rising temperatures, and increasing water consumption intersect with the uneven territorial distribution of dams and reservoirs, and with asymmetrical power relations, both at the international and local scales, to determine who gains access to water, when, and at whose expense.
So in a way, we can say that there's nothing really natural about scarcity, and I'd like to argue that now, because that was kind of the question that was asked. Often, we really buy physical scarcity exists. So yes, there are dwindling ice caps and groundwater levels are declining, but largely scarcity is socio-political and it is manufactured. It's manufactured through political and social processes, and these often legitimize certain interventions. So I spent a lot of time studying a very controversial dam in Western India. Gloria, you also looked at that project. And that project was constructed largely in the name of drought and to help people, but that water never went there. It mostly went to very, very powerful actors. And in a way, there's enough water and food to go around, but the problem is how we see scarcity and how it is socially generated. So it's really important to look at questions of allocation, access, entitlement, and social justice.
The voice you just heard belongs to Laila Kouta, from the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. The excerpt is taken from the first urban dialogue held during the 24th Triennale Milano International Exhibition in October 2025, a joint initiative of Triennale Milano, Politecnico di Milano, and developed with the framework of craft and curated by a Datsu research team. In her contribution to the dialogue, socio-environmental and climate inequalities between international perspectives and local impacts, Mehta moved beyond a narrow understanding of water scarcity as a purely physical condition. Instead, she framed scarcity as something produced through governance, arrangements, infrastructural choices, and regimes of allocation. Despite the obvious differences between the cases she discussed and the ones examined here, one key insight remains. Scarcity is not simply given by nature. It is politically and institutionally constructed. And her perspective is particularly useful for us to understand why communities around La Boquilla experience water shortage not as a natural disaster, but as something imposed through distant political and economic decisions. Bakker and Barnes pushed the argument further. In the US-Mexico Water Treaty, scarcity does not emerge only from dams, droughts, and diplomatic agreements, but from the calculative apparatus that makes water governable. Rules, deficit ledgers, delivery quotas, and monitoring protocols. Through these devices, uneven hydrological conditions are translated into standardized obligations. This becomes visible in the asymmetrical structure of the treaty itself. Although in legal terms, both the United States and Mexico are granted flexibility under the treaty, water scarcity intensified by climate change does not affect the two countries in the same way. As we have seen, the United States benefits from a territorial organization that allows it to absorb and redistribute risk. A dense network of reservoirs and storage systems stretches out across the basin, making it possible to buffer shortages, delay releases, and smooth out the impacts of drought over time. A century of infrastructuralization, together with the institutionalization of water allocation practices and the financialization of its value, have played a central role in producing water scarcity in northern Mexico. The Colorado and Rio Grande basins are governed by different hydrosocial regimes, uneven yet tightly connected through the treaty and the infrastructures that make its operation possible across space. What links them is the growing financialization of water, namely the transformation of rivers, reservoirs, and delivery obligations into a medium for storing and accumulating its value, a system of exchange that underpins US-Mexico relations. But as we have seen, this extraction of value is never abstract. It is always materialized, in dams, in river basins, and in specific territories like Chihuahua, where the physical work of making that value real is carried out, and where its costs are ultimately borne. Victor Daniel adds a further level of complexity, discussing how water is unevenly distributed also at the local scale.
And Monterrey, Nuevo León, a few years ago, like maybe 1-2 years ago, they had a problem with water, like because there is many people, I think like 8 million people living in that city. So they have a very long drive. There was not many rain in the state, so I saw that many communities that they are apart from the metropolis, from the main city, they were having problems with water. For example, many people write that they are obligatory for the government to accomplish in the community. They were affected by but only like in the low-income communities, like all the government were directing all the resources to the main city, like the zones where all the tourists or the companies were established. So
not only that, but also the environmental constraints which make the treaty's rigid requirements feel impossible to meet.
Because of the climate change, we in Mexico, we haven't had many rains in the past few years. So like all the water treaty, if I remember well, is that we provide US with I don't know how many liters of water every year from I think the Rio Bravo and many other water bodies. But those bodies of water, they get fed with the rains, like all the rains, all the water that the mountains send to the river, to the lakes. So it is not like our problem or we don't have control about it.
In analyzing the water dispute, a significant part of our work initially focused on the form of the conflict, not only on its material dimension, but also on the language through which the conflict is constructed and circulated. In an initial reading, it appeared to us that at the international and diplomatic level, the dispute between Mexico and the United States was predominantly handled through technical and ostensibly neutral register. Hydrological data, legal interpretations, and references to treaty compliance. Within this frame, decisions tend to be presented as the outcome of general principles and objective constraints, rather than as the result of power relations. By contrast, the explicit use of threats, pressure, and forms of negotiation seem to emerge mainly at the state and local scales, where the conflict takes on a far more visible, material, and coercive form. This initial distinction, however, proves to be only partially adequate. Even at the international level, the water dispute is by no means devoid of instruments of pressure and threat. The use of commercial levers, such as threat of imposing tariffs, reveal how logics of bargaining also operate within arenas that are formally technical and diplomatic. At the same time, arguing is not absent at local scales. Rather, it emerges in less visible and less institutionalized forms, in informal assemblies, in conversations among farmers, and in messages exchanged via chat, where data are discussed, experiences of scarcity are compared, and shared interpretations of what is happening are collectively produced. Here, too, arguments are articulated, but they rarely gain access to the official spaces of decision-making. This suggests that the difference across scales does not so much concern the presence or absence of power, but rather the forms through which power is rendered speakable, legitimate, or conversely, concealed. In this sense, the distinction proposed by political theorist John Elster between arguing and bargaining provides a particularly useful analytical lens, one that, from our perspective, required an additional step. Elster focused primarily on the discursive modes through which collective decisions are justified. Arguing relies on reasons that claim general validity and impartiality, while bargaining is based on threats and promises, sometimes supported by material resources. However, his analysis remains largely oriented towards the construction of discourse, leaving a crucial question in the background: how access to the spaces in which arguing and bargaining actually matter is produced, enabled, or denied. The actions carried out from below, ranging from the occupation of dams to the direct extraction of water and the interruption of flows, do not constitute forms of bargaining in the Elsterian sense of the term. They do not operate primarily at the discursive level, but rather at the level of the material conditions that make participation and political debate possible. In this sense, such practices do not produce arguments or negotiations in themselves. Instead, they produce the conditions under which something can be said, heard, argued, and negotiated, forcing the re-politicization of a water order that is otherwise presented as purely technical or as difficult to modify.
There is a lot of ranchers that doesn't have the allowance to make a well in the surface. Many people do it illegally because the subbasins are in the ranch, so technically it's their property. Well, I think they do it for survival. So if they don't get any income in the year from the ranch, like they don't have to eat, they don't have how to feed his family, his workers.
As Victor Daniel explains, many ranchers in the Río Conchos basin drill wells without authorization because water is perceived as embedded in the land itself. These practices cannot be reduced to simple illegality. They express a deeper conflict over water ownership, opposing a state-centered conception of water as a transferable and accountable resource to a territorial understanding that considers water as an integral part of landed property. Local actors are largely excluded from the institutional arenas in which technical and legal arguments are formulated, recognized, and made to count as legitimate. Access to both arguing and bargaining is therefore structurally unequal. Not everyone can participate in political discussion on the terms and in the languages that matter. In this context, material practices such as unauthorized water extraction can be read as a form of bargaining from below. This is not bargaining in Elster's discursive sense, nor a freely chosen negotiation strategy, but a materially grounded mode of political action aimed at gaining access to or repositioning oneself within the decision-making arena. In the case of wells, such practices function as an attempt to secure de facto access to the sphere of choice. In the case of infrastructure occupations, they operate as an explicit forcing of existing positions. Through direct control over the physical resources, ranchers impose costs on the existing governance regime and force the reopening of a dispute that would otherwise remain framed as a matter of mere technical compliance. In Mexico, water functions as natural capital. It is captured, stored, circulated, and put to work within specific historical and material arrangements. In Neil Smith's terms, this process can be understood as the production of second nature, a form of nature reorganized to serve accumulation. Rethinking scarcity in terms of territorial governance, therefore, also means situating the conflict at La Boquilla within Mexico's broader hydrogeography, where, perhaps more clearly than elsewhere, the fracture between use value and exchange value become material. While water remains indispensable for local livelihoods and agricultural reproduction, it is simultaneously abstracted and mobilized as an economic resource across scales. This exchange value becomes most visible in the forms through which water is appropriated. Appropriation here names the set of practices, regulations, and infrastructures that transform water from a territorial resource into an asset. In Mexico, these forms are numerous, and they point to a broader landscape in which water scarcity and the tensions generated by the 1944 treaty with the United States cannot be read as isolated phenomena. Instead, they need to be situated within a wider configuration of water appropriation and control. The most immediate and visible form is illegal extraction. In 2025, the National Water Commission, the federal authority responsible for regulating water rights and concessions, and known as CONAGUA, launched a review of nearly all water titles, revoking irregular concessions held by politicians and former state governors. This intervention made explicit something that water scarcity is the outcome of long-standing regimes of allocation, privilege, and uneven access. And these forms of appropriation are not limited to illegal practices. They are also structurally embedded in the design of Mexico's territorial and water governance. In 1992, the reforms introduced under President Carlos Salinas de Gortari redefined water as an economically mobilizable resource, expanding concession-based regimes and separating access to water from land ownership. This regulatory shift was further consolidated with the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, in 1994, which embedded Mexico's water governance framework within a broader geography of transnational trade and investment. While NAFTA did not directly privatize water, it reinforced market-oriented governance structures and investor protections, extending the scale at which water-related infrastructures and resources were valued and managed. The expansion of the soft drink industry offers a telling illustration of this dynamic. Mexico's entry into NAFTA coincided with a significant increase in foreign direct investment from the United States, including the opening of Coca-Cola's first bottling plant in San Cristobal de las Casas in 1994. Today, much of the soda market is dominated by Coca-Cola FEMSA. According to the data produced by Coca-Cola in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy, the production of half a liter of Coca-Cola requires approximately 35 liters of water. FEMSA operates a bottling plant in San Cristobal de las Casas, a context in which roughly one-third of the rural population lacks access to portable water.
Shop after shop here advertises Coca-Cola, but the one thing this neighborhood does not have is running water.
Residents of this neighborhood invited us to see what's left in their municipal water tanks.
Los tres tanques. Jose is telling me that these 3 tanks are the main source of water for this community. Jose, abre la puerta, por favor. Can you open the lid?
Sin agua, no water.
Sin agua.
¿Cuántas semanas sin agua?
Semanas como 3 semanas sin agua.
So 3 weeks without water.
This example does not serve to single out a specific company, but to illustrate how water scarcity is produced through regulatory frameworks that prioritize exchange value. Importantly, this logic is not confined to market transactions. The water deliveries demanded by the United States under the 1944 treaty do not operate through price or exchange, yet they rely on the same abstraction of water as a quantifiable, transferable flow secured through infrastructure and law. In this sense, treaty compliance functions as a parallel mechanism of valorization, embedding water and its infrastructures within a regime where value is produced through control, allocation, and territorial reorganization, rather than through the market alone.
It is the end of an era. The only sugar mill in the state of Texas is now shutting down. The Texas Farm Bureau tells us that the Rio Grande Valley sugar growers made that decision to close the facility because they just don't have enough water to keep the crops alive.
Yeah, the Bureau blames the ongoing water issues with Mexico under a treaty dating back to 1944. As Max Massey reports, the Bureau says this closure will cost hundreds of jobs and hundreds of millions of dollars for the Texas economy.
The closure of the Rio Grande Valley Sugar Growers Incorporated and the stream of press releases and videos that followed allows us to shift the lens to the other side of the border. From Chihuahua to Texas, and more specifically to the stretch of Texan territory that depends directly on the waters of the Rio Grande and its tributaries, many of which, as we've seen, originate and flow through Mexican territory. For the local economy, the situation is described as devastating. In a video titled End of an Era, the Texas Farm Bureau presents its account. Over the years, the narrative goes, Mexico has built dams to capture water that should have been delivered downstream to Texas. The camera lingers on powerful imagery. The chairman of the Rio Grande Valley sugar growers standing beside the vast warehouses that once stored processed sugar. The space is monumental and now empty. He describes what he calls the final production season, the last harvest processed in that facility. He recounts attempts to be heard, to negotiate through the appropriate channels, such as the International Boundary and Water Commission, the State Department, representatives in Washington, D.C., but in his telling, nothing moved. The video continues with another local voice asking a pointed question. How is it possible that the United States cannot enforce compliance from Mexico? Why, they ask, can Mexico not be compelled to act as good stewards of water as the U.S. claims to do? In recent months, the prospects of reopening the sugar mill by Santa Rosa Sugar, LLC, explicitly aimed at restoring the sugar production chain in the Rio Grande Valley, has revived the possibility of bringing the Rio Grande Valley sugar growers' facilities back into operation. The episode, however, is not merely industrial and allows us to read the conflict beyond a moral opposition between farmers on the two sides of the border. Rather, it helps us observe the different position these territories occupy within the same hydrosocial regime. For decades, hydrological variability in the basin has been absorbed through territorially concentrated adjustments on the Mexican side of the system, as we have seen and discussed so far. The closure of the mill marks the moment when this compensatory mechanism no longer succeeds in stabilizing at a distance the conditions of production in the Texan Valley. Hydrological uncertainty thus translates into economic instability, not because water suddenly disappears, but because the political territorial infrastructure that guaranteed its regularity ceases to hold. In this sense, the case of the sugar industry in the Rio Grande Valley signals a shift from territorialized scarcity to systemic risk. What was previously contained within a specific basin now enters the economic circuit that depends on its stabilization. It is perhaps this displacement of variability, more than the water deficit itself, that fuels the conflict we have analyzed. The point is that the cycle following the one we have analyzed, which began in 2020 and ended in October 2025, does not suggest any improvement. On the contrary, according to climate projections, the average temperature of the Rio Grande basins is expected to rise between 4 and 10 degrees Fahrenheit, with potentially dramatic consequences, especially for the Conchos River Basin. Here, annual runoff could decline by up to 25% by 2050 due to the combined effects of changes in precipitation and rising temperatures, as already indicated in the 2015 Mexico Water Vulnerability Atlas. Material data inevitably overlap with political considerations. The agreement reached at the end of 2020, which had temporarily unlocked the most critical situation, concluded with the commitment to sign another one by 2023, with the aim of increasing the reliability and predictability of Mexican water deliveries and, at the same time, initiating a discussion on water-saving measures, efficiency improvements, and the possible use of water from other Mexican tributaries in addition to those already specified in the treaty. Internal resistance within Mexico, particularly from the state of Chihuahua, played a decisive role in preventing the realization of this minute, effectively leaving the structural nodes of the conflict unresolved. The current cycle began at the end of 2025 and will close in 2030. We could offer evidence-based projections about what will happen then, but that is not the point. Instead, we will return to La Boquilla because it is there that the territorial foundations of the transboundary water order become visible. The question with which we will close is twofold. Will the historical mechanisms that have so far contained scarcity continue to be whole? And if they fail, what new territorial configuration will be called upon to absorb uncertainty? It is perhaps here that the most genetic profile of water-related conflicts is defined. Not in the absence of water itself, but in the despotifs that organize the distribution of risk. The US-Mexico border is one laboratory among others, a case through which to read what elsewhere is only beginning to emerge or has always already been there. You've been listening to Flows of Power, How Water Treaties Produce Water Scarcity, a production by Urbanary, developed within the course Conflict Management and Resolution during the 2025 to 2026 academic year. Special thanks to Victor Daniel, who generously shared his experience with us. We also thank Craft for allowing us to use audio material from the event organized during the Triennale. Recording, editing, and post-production were carried out by Giorgio Mattina. Editorial supervision was provided by the course teaching staff and the Urbanary editorial group.
Urbanary is produced in collaboration with Poly Radio and the Department of Architecture and Urban Studies at Politecnico di Milano.